Hi everyone, welcome to part two of my intermediate park jet series, setup series. If you've watched the first video, and if you haven't, I will link it down below. I touched briefly on rudders and what they can do for your park jet. They don't, there's not everybody uses them, and that's certainly fine. It's a personal choice. So I wanted to share with you my experiences and what has worked best for me with rudders, because there are actually some park jets that you'll get the plans for, and the designer may not have even set them up or cut out, put rudders on the plan. So maybe you think, oh, well, I want to add my own rudders. What should I do? How should I go about it? That sort of thing. When I was part of the NAMC, North American MiG Consortium, when we were designing our original airplane, the MiG-35, which we later called the MiG-35A, since replaced by the MiG-35B, we did a lot of testing and experimentation leading up to that with rudder size, rudder shape, rudder orientation in relation to the hinge line in relation to the wing plate. So I've done quite a bit of playing around and testing, and I've found certain things that just work well for me. The one thing about rudders in a park jet, especially maybe because they are behind the prop, and in addition to the airflow that's already going over the plane as it flies, you're getting extra forces put on them by the prop wash. So what can happen sometimes with a park jet, depending on the size of the rudders, how much throw you have, how aggressive you get, is that rudder, too aggressive rudder input can actually cause the plane to roll, almost like a snap roll, which sometimes, depending on where you're, what you're doing with your rudder, is if you apply too much rudder, you're flying along, you apply too much rudder, say you go to the right, the plane starts to do this. You almost have to apply left opposite aileron in order to continue the sort of flat turn with the rudder. But certain things I've found through experimentation you can help with that. So I also fly normally in the pitch and the roll. I fly with, on my main transmitter, I fly with about 15% expo. I like to put a little bit more into the rudder, about 20%. I just find it keeps it a little bit softer, and I don't tend to get a little bit ham-fisted with the controls. So, if you are going to set up rudders, keep that in mind. Maybe you might want to carry a little bit more expo in them than you do with the other control surfaces, especially if maybe you're going to be doing some high alpha or seriously slow flying, where being very, very delicate on the rudder input will be important to keep your plane doing what you want to do. So from a standpoint of hinge orientation, I have found that having the hinge line here essentially perpendicular to the wing plate tends to reduce that roll input that can be induced by the rudder. I found, like on this Sioux, for example, the original hinge line for the rudder comes down at an angle and then actually angles down this way. On other planes like the MiG-29, what I found that really induced a lot of rudder roll, especially if you're trying to fly high alpha. I mean, the main thing when you're trying to fly high alpha is you're trying to keep the wings fairly level, and you're turning the plane in the yaw, because you're at such an extreme angle of attack going so slow. If you put too much roll input, it can easily tip stall and then fall out of the sky. So perpendicular rudder hinges seem to work the best. I found through experimentation that sometimes smaller is better, so size does matter. For example, I experimented with the rudders on this F-15 version 5. You can see I made them quite small, but they're very effective. I got this from the rudders on, I think, the F-15 version 5, or F-18 version 5, and the Eurofighter version 5. Also the F-16 version 5, which obviously has a single fin, has a fairly small rudder like that, and they're still quite effective. So yeah, don't you're better off to go, if you're going to experiment with them, you're better off to go a little bit smaller, and then increase your throw, and then if you build the plane again, well then maybe increase it by a little bit. I remember a few years ago building a sort of a souped up MiG-29 version 1 where I put all the controls, ailerons, of course elevons, I put KF4s on it, everything else, and I also put rudders on it, and the rudders were way too big. I mean, if I just flinched on the stick on the rudder, the plane was snapping all over the place. So if you're interested in that, I'll link that video down below. If it was a lot of fun. It was actually, not to get too far off base, but it was actually one of the most locked in versions of the MiG-29 version 1 I'd ever flown, and because I had all the surfaces, I could really get it to do some really good aerobatics. So as I mentioned in the previous video, you have a couple of different options, depending on how many servos you have and how light you want it. You can run a single servo, sort of in the back here with the long double control servo arm, and then run a control horn to each rudder. Like I said before, the best thing to do is run. What I've done is sort of run the servo wire out and run it on the outside here. You probably will have to use like a servo extension wire of some kind, and then run it back in up here. That way, even if you tape it or whatever else, if you run it on the inside here, close to the prop, if the tape comes loose, then you're in danger of cutting that with your prop. And it's not so much if you lost your rudder, but if it bound up the prop and your plane stopped flying, it could be a real bad day. So yeah, or the other thing is you can run them with 2 servos. Now I tend to like to run most of my setups with 2 servos like that, with the linkages on the outside. It's just my personal preference because I like to keep this area back here in between, behind the prop slot. I like to keep that as clean as possible, but that's just what's worked for me. And then normally what I do, because I run with 6-channel receivers, is I'll run my rudders into the receiver using a Y harness. So just one plug in the receiver, and then one rudder servo in each end of the Y harness. So one thing that I've learned with certain planes, and this didn't dawn on me until I got to a situation a couple of years ago where I was flying a plane, and I found, especially as it significantly changed speed, like as it accelerated or as it slowed down, it would sort of dip a wing and sort of roll to one side. And I kept trimming and trimming and trimming and trimming, but I was only trimming in the roll axis, and I just never was really fixing it. And I had tons and tons of trim in, which I didn't necessarily like. And then for some reason it dawned on me that maybe I was having a problem in the yaw, because like I said before, sometimes it can be a bit misleading if let's say one of your vertical stabilizers is not quite aligned properly, and the plane, it wants to tend to roll a little bit, because the rudders, as I mentioned at the start, can also induce roll in addition to yaw if there's too much deflection. That, I think what was happening, or I found out what was happening with that plane, was that it was a yaw problem more than a roll problem. So I started inputting a little bit of trim in my rudder, and it actually cleared the problem up really quickly. I was able to get rid of a lot of my aileron trim, my roll trim, and I just had 3 or 4 clicks of yaw trim, and it made a huge difference. So that's something, if you are using rudders and you find your airplane is doing a particular thing, and putting in roll input is not necessarily fixing it, try putting in a little bit of yaw input, in a little bit of trim into your rudder, and you may find that will help clear up the problem. Or you can even put a little bit of both, and then you may find that it'll straighten your airplane out and help it fly a little straighter. So yeah, so just the basics. If you are going to use rudders, you're not used to rudders, do like you normally, good practice. Excuse me. Take it up nice and high, 100 feet or more, and see how your plane reacts. If you shove the rudder over too hard, and your plane, does one of these, or tries to do a roll, then maybe you need to reduce down your throw to get it dialed in just right. If you want to have rudders because your focus is to fly some high alpha, then maybe start off with a little bit more rudder expo, so that you can keep things smooth, so that the plane will stay fairly flat as it turns and not roll, because rolling in high alpha often will cause you to tip stall. So and again, sometimes you're not going to have the opportunity to make a straight, just because the way the vertical stabilizer is designed. For example, on the F-18, it's a little bit tough to do that, because it's angled in at the back too, to put the vertical, put the hinge line perpendicular to the wing plate. But for me, I found that works really well. If you are going to make the rudder, if the plane doesn't come with them, I would suggest starting off a little bit small, and then you can always adjust the throw up a little bit higher, rather than too big. And you might get to a point, like I mentioned with my modified MiG-29 version 1, I could just never seem to get the throw small enough, and if I just twitched on those rudders, it was whack. It was wanting to put it into a rudder roll. So yeah, so I encourage you to experiment. One other thing just popped into my head. If you run a 2-servo setup as well, depending on the plane that you want, you can also get really fancy and introduce, and your transmitter can handle it. You can introduce like a V-tail thing. So when you pull up, let's say on the elevators here, your 2 rudders go in, and it really just accentuates the pitch. The other thing that I've played with, which is kind of fun too, if you want to, is you can have that on a switch, and then when you come into land, if you decide to pop flaps down, you can have these deflect in or deflect out. If you have them deflect in, it actually helps hold the nose up a little bit, so that if you pop your flaps and it wants the nose to drop, if you have a little bit of this, it helps almost give you kind of an air brake thing. So you can play around with that if your transmitter has the capability. So that's another option. If you really want to play around and have some fun, challenge yourself, that's something else that rudders can give you. So anyway, hopefully that's helped. Give you some ideas, some thoughts. Anyway, if you want to play around or experiment with rudders, I like I said, I probably only fly with them, use them about 5% of the time, but now that I've been flying with them for several years, I do like to have them on my plane, because I like to, when I need to go to the rudder, I like to have it there. So if you have any, again, like I said in the first video, if you have any other suggestions for something that you'd like me to discuss or talk about, please leave your question down below, and I'll either try and answer it in the comments, or I'll add a video to this setup series. In the next video, I will talk about my experiences with spoiler-ons, flapper-ons, that sort of stuff. Things that you can really take things to another level if you want to push your plane even further, if you have a transmitter that can do it. So thanks very much for watching. Blue skies, calm winds to everyone. Park jet noise, the other sound of freedom, baby. Take care.